my microphone on? Yes, it is. Good evening and welcome to this discussion we're going to have, which should be most interesting and illuminating, and welcome to all those tuning in on the internet around the world, of which there are many thousands of people, I'm told. We're going to explore the violin. We've been listening to some marvelous young players over the last week in the Michael Hill International Violin Competition. But I think it's a good time to explore the actual instruments that some of these fine players are playing. You may have noticed in your programs that there's been an exciting development in the competition this year. For the first time, we have a violin prize. And more about that later, but suffice to say that it's a wonderful Niccolò Amati violin made in 1645, which belonged to the great French violinist Christian Ferrat for some time. So we're very excited about that, and one lucky contestant from the competition will have the use of that violin for the next couple of years. Now, the title of tonight's discussion is Are Older Violins Better? Now, that's rather a polemic statement, and I'd rather discuss, are they different? I certainly have my own views as a violinist, and I'd like to welcome to the stage, first of all, Diane Hu is the New Zealand emerging artist, and a little bit later on she's going to play the same excerpt on each of these violins we have here. I think it's important for one person with one bow to play the same thing on each violin, otherwise everybody who picks up a violin will make it sound differently. As the old joke about Heifetz goes, someone said, "Mr. Heifetz, your violin sounds fantastic," and he said, "I don't hear anything." And we also have from New York, Bruno Price and Ziv Arazi from Rare Violins of New York, who were instrumental, no pun intended, in obtaining this Amati, and I'll get them to talk about that later. On my right here is Richard Panting, a well-known luthier, and also a violinist, a professional violinist, once upon a time, he says. But like Ziv and Bruno, I believe, is a cellist, and I'm, of course, a violinist as well. I should introduce myself. I'm Dean Olding, the artistic advisor of the Michael Hill competition. Yes, so we're all able to play these instruments and get a perspective, and I think as a maker, you'll have a unique perspective, Richard, of how a violin feels as you're making it. Well, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to, who wants to talk first, Ziv or Bruno? Bruno will start, and he might give us a bit of a background on this Amati violin and perhaps one of the other violins you've brought with you.
Well, thank you for the introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here, our first trip to New Zealand and hopefully not our last. This Amati is actually owned by a friend of ours in Italy, Stefano Rancho. And Ziv was actually the one who persuaded him and talked to him about the idea of loaning it for the competition. And the idea, it really stemmed from a conversation with a friend of ours a few years ago who said to us, you know, all these violins are becoming more and more expensive. There is no artist around who can afford any of these. Bruno, if you don't do something to make sure that instruments get into the hands of players, we're not going to hear them. And if you don't do it, who's going to do it? And he threw down the gauntlet. And last year we formed a consortium to basically allow owners of many instruments who are not loaning them to enjoy them being played. We would be guaranteeing that they'd be looked after, that we'd make sure they're insured, and all of the headaches would be taken care of. And the pleasure that these owners have received from owning these instruments and hearing them on stage was so much greater than they expected. And many of our colleagues in the violin business world have realized that it's a good thing to do. But they do have to be looked after, and one of the most strict rules that we have is that our responsibility is to hand on these instruments in the same condition as they are now to the next generation. So, this is how
it's a fantastic initiative, and I applaud it wholeheartedly. There are various foundations around the world, or instrument banks, whatever you like to call them, who do lend these top violins or these very expensive violins to concertizing violinists around the world. And I wish we had more of them in the South Pacific area, but that's another story. But at least this is a good start. I know in Australia there are a few benefactors who have bought fine instruments for various orchestras and so on. So Ziv, tell me a little bit more about this particular Amati.
So this Amati was made in Cremona in 1645 and was owned in the early part of the career of Christian Ferra, who was a very well-known violinist. Unfortunately, he had a tragic life and died at a very early age. But the violin passed along. When he acquired his Strad later on in his career, he passed it to a student of his, and the current owner acquired it from the student's widow. So there's still a very direct connection to Christian Ferra.
I should point out, for those in the audience who might not know a lot about Niccolo Amati, there were a few generations of Amati. His father was one of the so-called brothers Amati, and his grandfather, Andrea Amati, was perhaps the founder of the modern violin as we know it, or one of the earlier makers. Niccolo was the most revered member of the family, and he lived a long life. And amongst others, he taught Stradivari how to make violins. And Stradivari, I think, started in his workshop at age 14 or so. Would that be correct?
There is a slight chance that maybe he was not in the workshop.
Oh, right. Well,
there's the latest of... But there's, without any question, Niccolo Amati was the dominant figure in Cremona. And certainly the first violins that Stradivari made were made in homage, and on the first, I think, 2 violins he put on the label alumnus Niccolo Amati. And it's basically the model that Amati reached with this instrument in the 1640s. That was the model that was basically adopted by Stradivari, and those first instruments from 1666 onwards were a development from this.
Now, a violin looks like a deceptively simple instrument, but it's actually made up of many different parts. I think there are around 90 different parts in a violin. Would that be roughly? Well, it depends on how you count them. There are 4 strings, so there are 4 already, and there's a mute on the end. 65, 68 parts, how you count, depending on how you count them.
Yeah, you can have a 1-piece back or a 2-piece back. That obviously adds 1. If you count the individual strands that make up the decorative purfling inlay, each of those strands is made up of 3 parts of wood. So in a violin, what's that? 3, 6, 9, 12, 14, 16 extra bits of wood that just make the top or the back. So, there are many ways to count it, but there are a lot of bits of wood in there to contribute to the simple-looking thing it is.
Apart from their beautiful shape and so on, they're a marvel of architecture, really, or engineering. They have to stand pounds and pounds of pressure from the strings, and of course the modern pitches that we play at and with steel strings add extra pressure, so it's all the more remarkable that these violins over here, who are 300 years old, which are 300 years old or so, can have withstood so well the rigors of time. Perhaps we go to Richard Panting, and he can talk about perhaps the differences in modern making styles compared to Strad. I mean, as a maker, you must get asked the question, do you make a Strad model or a Guarneri model, as the sort of standard question?
Yeah, that's often asked, and for a very good reason, because violin making, like so much of instrument making and other branches of woodworking, I suppose, is very much a conservative thing. And ideas were tried and discarded or adopted because they created an improvement on what was already existing. So it's not surprising that today the majority of makers like myself would probably look to the famous makers of the past for inspiration, and sometimes you find people who are able to make replicas of some of these famous instruments that are so realistic that they're very hard to tell apart, visually at any rate. And there's a very good reason that we follow these examples, because Stradivari was responsible for taking the Amati model, which was sort of becoming dominant in Italy, and making significant improvements that allowed it to be played in larger halls instead of the private churches and palaces where music was, up till that time, mainly performed, and or classical music, that is, so-called. And Strad's modifications, including slightly different bass bar, which is one of the reinforcing struts inside, different neck, a flatter curvature of the plates, which allowed them to vibrate more freely, produced an instrument that had, even in those days, had significantly more carrying power than the older German instruments that a lot of musicians were playing and liked. So, yeah.
I think if Stradivari and Amati were alive today, they probably wouldn't recognize their own instruments, because they've changed or had to change so much. You mentioned the shorter neck and, of course, the steel strings and the bass bar and so on. What do you think Stradivari sounded like on day one when the varnish was still wet?
It's very difficult to speculate about that, because one of the things that most people don't realize is the difference between the gut strings that were used quite commonly right up until early in the 1900s, all handmade, the twisted sheep intestine that goes through a whole transformative experience. But the final stage of that is a hand polishing process, which invariably leads to inconsistencies in the quality of the string. So that was a big factor, because pitch itself was, musical pitch that is, was much lower then, commonly around 415 cycles for an A, which is our standard tuning frequency, to the 440 that we use, and sometimes higher than that in the present time. That creates a lot of extra tension on the instrument. And the early instruments like Strad had much lighter reinforcing strut inside the bass bar. And we know that because there are several instruments that have still their original, or had still their original bass bars, and they're probably about half the dimension and therefore the strength that a modern bass bar would have.
That's right. When you hear these violins later, you'll probably notice some of them have a very bright soprano kind of sound, and others might have a more deeper, darker mezzo-soprano, if you like, sound. What do you try and achieve? What do you make it for the person that's buying it? If they say, I want a brighter sound or a darker sound, is that possible to predict?
I don't personally have sufficient confidence in my own making to say definitively that I'm going to make an instrument with a particular sound characteristic. But what usually happens is that someone comes to me and says, I saw one of your instruments, or I heard one, or I played it, and I liked it, can you make me one like that? And you can say, well, that particular instrument was modeled after a such and such Guarneri del Gesù, because he's a maker that I particularly adore, and I can make one like that, and it will have some of the characteristics of instruments that you might have heard, because I'm the maker, and every maker, like it or not, usually imparts some of their own DNA, I suppose, into an instrument, whether it's the way you handle your tools or your perceptions, or might even be the way you hear musical sounds. You know, some people might not like a very piercing, brilliant E-string sound, for example, and they might adjust their making style to make something that sounded mellower. But I think most makers today at least have to make an instrument that they think will work very well in larger concert halls, and that means having something that has a certain amount of volume and projection. Not all instruments have that. Of course, the very finest of the old instruments have that, you know, in great quantities.
And if we could go back to the Amati for a second, Ziv or Bruno, would you like to comment on how would you describe the sound? And perhaps you might hold up the Amati and maybe the Strad for the audience while we're talking about it.
So the Amati is actually quite dark sounding instrument. I think someone described it as dark chocolate because there's sort of creamy texture to the sound that you can almost feel. The Strad, in comparison, is bright and clear and shimmering. So they're very different, and in fact, all of these instruments are quite different, and I'm sure you'll be able to very easily grasp how different they sound. The one thing that is difficult to understand is how they make the player feel, and that is something that you might be able to elaborate on.
Well, I'm often fooled. I mean, a great player will still sound like a great player no matter what violin he's playing, and very individual. But I think the real difference is for the player himself. When you pick up a different instrument, it speaks to you, it's easy to play, or it has a natural affinity with your own natural sound. And we can talk about sound, but it's a bit like talking about perfume. You just can't really describe it. So I think perhaps we should move on to, if Diane, our volunteer here, as I said earlier, it's important to have one person play it, because if I played it, it would sound completely different to if Diane played it, and Richard, and so on. So perhaps without further ado, would you mind giving us a little excerpt on each violin? And we might just mention what you're going to play. Do you want to go left to right or right to left?
I think probably youngest to oldest.
Youngest
maybe.
to oldest, all right. So youngest would be your violin. That would be this one. This is one made in 2016 by this gentleman to my right. Bravo to Dick Panting for producing that lovely instrument. Auckland's own. Thank you very much, Diane. It's no easy thing to pick up strange violins and play, especially in public like this. The next oldest would be this Zygmuntovich. And Zygmuntovich is New York-based, isn't he? He is a modern maker who has found favor with many fine players around the world. This particular instrument belongs to Ning Feng, who is on the judging panel. So this is, I forget how old, oh, it's only 2017 this one was made. It's actually younger than the other one, sorry. I think you'll agree, both the modern instruments have a very healthy sound and quite powerful instruments, I would say. What would be next oldest? Oh, perhaps Diane. Now, Diane's is anonymous. He didn't think to put a label on it, whoever he or she made it. But we think it's about 100 years old, or? It's a copy of a Galliano, so Italian also, yes. You're tuning, I hope you're tuning your ears in and getting to hear some of the subtle differences between these instruments. Now we move into rather expensive territory, I must say. We have a beautiful Guadagnini here belonging to Sir Michael Hill. It's this one, I hope, that I'm picking up the right one. Otherwise it wouldn't be embarrassing. Guadagnini would be very much sought after by concert violinists for their rather big sound, and really considered up there with Stradivari and Guarneri del Gesù and these makers. This is 1755, sorry. All very different qualities. Bravo, bravo. we might switch chronologically the last two, but they're the oldest violins here. We have the Marti, that's the subject of this prize, and that's here from, tell me the year again, 1645. 1645. Thank you very much. And last but not least, we have a beautiful Antonio Stradivari violin from 1712. Sadly, we're going to run out of time very shortly, but just perhaps as a closing comment, Ziv or Bruno, could you talk a little bit about this Cremonese sound? And so many players talk about the carrying power of a sound. Is that real?
We often find that things don't necessarily sound the same under your ear as a musician and in the back row of a hall. And it takes space for the sound to unfold, and it is normally that focus and clarity of a Cremonese instrument that takes that space of a hall and unfolds and will hit the last row as if you're sitting in the first row. So there is something to it. Yeah.
Well, there must be, otherwise so many fine violinists wouldn't be pursuing these instruments. But for Richard, the last word, perhaps. In the world of piano, we have Steinway as the most famous brand of piano. But in more recent times, there have been a few piano makers trying to develop a new sound, or at least a different sound. Where do you think the world of violin making will be going in the next 50, 100 years? Are we looking for a different kind of sound?
That's a difficult question because an apple's an apple is an apple, and there are lots of different flavors and colors and sizes and so forth. Some keep longer than others. Instruments, already we have electric violins that can be connected to any sort of amplifier and modified in any way that the player actually can imagine, and lots probably don't even imagine what that comes out. But I honestly think that with most of the players that I associate with or talk to or read about, is that they want an instrument that sounds like the best possible example that's been made, and usually they look to the older instruments of the past as an inspiration. But let's not be too precious about it, because there are lots of problems associated with an older instrument that a player has to learn to negotiate because they love the other characteristics of it. And you know, there are things like the reliability of an older instrument, which is made of wood, obviously, and therefore subject to changes in humidity and air pressure and so forth. So a lot of players are finding, especially the touring artists around the world, that having a Stradivari or a Guarneri or any other famous instrument that's 200 or 300 years old brings a set of problems that you don't necessarily think about when you're sitting in the audience. And I've seen several players, you know, moving to, say, a particularly humid climate from Europe, where the climate would be the opposite, and struggling with woofy sounds or squeaking E strings and things of that nature. So, I mean, in an ideal world, we wouldn't want to have to deal with any of those problems. But I don't know. I think we've almost reached a plateau where technique, modern scientific inquiry, has led an increasing number of makers to make uniformly excellent instruments, which of course means that there are more excellent instruments for people that are affordable, and of course there are a lot of more people nowadays that are playing modern stringed instruments or stringed instruments than there were back in Stradivari's time.
Is it a boost for the modern maker because the old ones are so expensive now that there's plenty of a market there for the new instruments?
Exactly, and fortunately we have shining examples of younger players or even more mature artists who deliberately choosing to play often on younger instruments, and therefore they're sort of setting a precedent for people to follow. And the stigma attached to playing a modern instrument, which used to be fairly prevalent, seems to be diminishing somewhat, which, you know, for us is only a good thing.
It is a good thing. Well, on that note, we have to leave it. But if any of you have a very fat checkbook, you can come up and we might be selling a few here. But thank you very much to, first of all, Richard Panting, our luthier from New Zealand, Zivaradzi, Bruno Price, who've flown all the way from New York just to hear this competition. We have to make the stage vacant now for the next round of the competition, the chain music round. And a special thanks to Diane Hu, our New Zealand emerging artist, for, no pressure Diane, but putting yourself through that, and playing on 6 strange instruments, or 5 strange instruments plus your own. Thank you very much to all of you for coming. Thank you.